My name is Ann Coy. I am the Healing City Baltimore coordinator. My role is in supporting Councilmember Cohen in implementing the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act. I also support the community movement of Healing City Baltimore, and I get to work with all of the incredible healers and helpers who are part of the movement here. I am excited that I will be taking you through the rest of our day together. We are thrilled to be able to share our first panel today. We are going to have the opportunity to learn about healing and trauma responsive care in education. We're excited to have representatives from Baltimore, Philadelphia, Mississippi, who will all be sharing about their unique approaches to integrating restorative and healing practices in the education system where they are. So today I am thrilled to introduce Chris Scott, the Senior Policy Advisor for Education and Youth Justice for Open Society Foundations. Chris will be moderating the panel for us today, and we are so grateful. Our other panelists include Ellen Reddy, the Executive Director of the Nolly Jenkins Family Center in Durant, Mississippi. We have Akil Ham, the Chief of Baltimore City Public Schools Police, and Deandre Smith, the Lead Relationships First Coach from Philadelphia United School District. So Chris, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. We're so excited to hear from you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning for this critically important conversation. As Ann said, I am Chris Scott. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for Open Society US and our Open Society Policy Center. I am also the founder and convener of the Federal School Discipline and Climate Coalition, a coalition focused on advancing the interests of Black and Brown youth at the federal level to end police in schools and support police-free schools, eliminate seclusion and restraints, and also eliminate the practice of corporal punishment, which is still practiced in 19 states across the country, particularly in the South. Today, I've been blessed to be joined by a wonderful group of panelists who will talk with us about what it means to have healing in education, and also talk through the programs that they are both leading and are instrumental in making sure it gets implemented throughout their schools. First, we'll hear from Ellen Reddy, who is the Executive Director of Nolly Jenkins Family Center Incorporated out of Durant, Mississippi. Next, we will hear from Deandre Smith, who is the lead coordinator for restorative practices for the Philadelphia Unified School District, and then followed by Chief Ham, who is the chief of the Baltimore City Public Schools Police Department. So with that said, we will kick it off. I will start with Deandre, and I will allow the panelists to provide 2 to 3 minutes to give an overview of themselves, but also articulate what brings them into this space and why this work is important to them. So Deandre.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Again, my name is Deandre Smith. A little bit of overview of myself. I'm from Charles County, Maryland, was raised in PG County, Maryland. I went through the juvenile system myself, was kicked out of schools, was sent to alternative schools. Had a chance to move away from some situations and turn my life around, and got a chance to go to college for free on a scholarship through sports, got a chance to get my master's degree. And now I want to give back to the city. I'm one of 10, and only 2 of us got a chance to go to college. So I know exactly how hard it is as African-American male to overcome a lot of obstacles and be able to lead other youth of all identifications and all types of backgrounds and be able to get them to the next level. Education is the first step to freedom. So that's my goal.
Thank you, Deandre. Ellen Reddy.
Good morning. My name is Ellen Reddy. I'm really happy to be here this morning. I'm the Executive Director for Nolly Jenkins Family Center. We're a community-based organization located in Holmes County, Mississippi. I guess I come to this work because I came from a community that said to me as a child, I had purpose. I grew up in rural Scriven County, Georgia. Our north, of course, was Baltimore City. I'm also a resident of Baltimore City. When I had my children, I lived in Omaha, Nebraska, and I came back to Baltimore City when my kids were probably in 5th grade. Placed them inside of public schools and recognized that the schools were not giving them what they needed. As a matter of fact, I held my son back in 6th grade because I blamed him for problems with teacher shortage and not teaching. Since I've been in Mississippi, I came here in 1994. And I recognized that corporal punishment was still going on. The first opportunity that we had to work around corporal punishment was a parent asked us to, as an organization, to come in and talk to her child. Well, what we did was we gathered all of the children and engaged the children in what was going on in the classroom. And there was some awful things going on. So I think my path to getting here, I attended Easton High School where we had our first walkout around cafeteria food. Betty Williams, who was our principal, came up and thought, oh, my girls are out on the lawn cutting up. But that was my first, I think, experience with activism. I grew up on the east side of Baltimore where the Black Panther Party was in the 1200 block of Gay Street. So I come from a community where I know the issues that impact our lives both personally and collectively as a community.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks, Deandre. And while we are waiting for Chief Ham to come, we'll jump into some questions. But I just want to, fill in a gap real quick, because I think Deandre alluded to something that I know a lot of folks in the community of Baltimore, particularly Black residents, face, right? My story isn't too dissimilar from Deandre with respects to, a football scholarship is what kept me out of prison and kept me from falling into the sort of trap of being engaged in violence, et cetera. And having been an educator and being an activist and advocate at the federal level in different spaces, the first question I want to throw to Deandre is sort of, how are you grappling with your own personal experience and relating that to the students that you interact with in Philadelphia, and how does that also connect to the sort of work that you're doing around restorative practices to not have punitive measures and or outcomes for the Black and brown students that you teach and interact with on a day-to-day basis?
Great question. Thank you, Chris. I think on the normal day of school, right, most of my students deal with trauma all day. That's where they come from, is trauma. Not only am I a RJ facilitator, I'm a football coach. So I get to be personally involved in these students' lives every day, just through sports. Sports was a safe haven for me. The team building, we pull from seven different middle schools, and we pour from 5 high schools to make one team. So there's a lot of street turfs, a lot of things that we have to get by to make a productive team. Being able to hold my students accountable and have high expectations, but give them high support is my model, right? Students are going to make mistakes. That's what we are. School, I like to think of it as a recreation of society, right? I'm going to give them time to make mistakes, and I'm going to guide them through it. Or there's some mistakes that they might not be able to come back from. I don't know, right? But I know that if I do my job 100% and more, and give them my experience. I've been arrested. I've been in some situations where I had to have older males to come and help me and guide me through those situations. I like to be that, not a father figure, but a big brother. A lot of them are very close to me in age. So being the big brother, like, hey, learn from my mistakes. Let me get you to step 1, step 2. I've drive my students around to HBCUs and try to get them accepted into these gap programs, where if they have a 2.5 or a 2.7, that they can go to summer school and get into college or go into prep school. Some of my students who are returning from the prison system, my first thing I've always go to them is, how can we heal you, right? There's been some harm. We know that harm, people who are harmed like to harm others, right? That's how we do, right? That's how it works. So addressing their harm and then coming to reconcile that hey, you've been harmed, but we can turn that harm into a mission, into a statement of, hey, this is my story and let my story guide you through these hardships, right? The biggest thing that I tell my students is that you can pass on hope to other people. That I've been through the worst that I've been through, but I'm still here surviving. Especially with my male Black students and my male and my African American females, right? We come from strong ancestry. We're here. We are living proof that we can survive, that we can thrive. And how do we do that? We have to be able to take everything that's given to us and use it as our power to uplift us.
Thank you, Deandre. Ellen, picking up the threads that and the wisdom and knowledge that Deandre put out there, can you talk a little bit about, to the folks that are listening, what corporal punishment is and how you are addressing it, and understanding that children, students, and youth will make mistakes, what your efforts are to come from a place of healing, not punishment, to help them grow and have better life outcomes?
Sure. And oftentimes in schools in the North, you don't have corporal punishment. Here in Mississippi, and as Chris said, in 19 other states, educators are allowed to hit children. And we're talking about hitting children with paddles that, may be larger than the child themselves. Not just wooden paddles, but sometimes these paddles are also wrapped in tape that amplifies the sound and the impact when that paddle hits the child. Corporal punishment may be slapping a child upside the head. It's not just using a paddle. It's how we talk to children. It's the words that we use. It's how undignified it is. Children now, and we worked for a very long time to move kids from being spanked inside of the classroom in front of other children into at least the principal's office. But even with that said, you can still hear a child cry out from the office, and that sound will reverberate throughout the school. I can remember walking into school buildings and hearing children cry, or seeing children go back to the classroom after being punished. And you can imagine peers will tease until it happens to them. So corporal punishment is really about educators and adults responding to what they perceive as inappropriate or misbehavior in order to change that behavior. And we all know that hitting children will not change behavior. It may stop the behavior at that particular time, but it does not change behavior. I listened in early on, and I heard Zeke and I believe Karen Weber talk about engaging young people. And that's part of our work. We work in an intergenerational model. I am the elder of the organization, and I will soon be 70 years old. We have adults. We have other children, young adults, old adults, young children, very young children inside of our work. Because part of this is that as elders and adults, we have to, again, bring back those skills and those tools that we use inside of communities. I heard Karen talk about restorative circles. That's the way we've always done. In the South, when we got together, we're in circles. Even when you think about African traditions, we have a conflict dispute model where we take our young people back to Timbuktu. We get them to understand their history before coming to the Americas, and understanding the richness, the power that communities have. We get them to interview their elders. Oftentimes, this is a farm community. Holmes County was the first place where there was a Black co-op, meaning that folk fed themselves. We come from communities that have always nurtured children. And so part of our work is saying to school officials, take the paddles out of your hand. Can you imagine? I have an undergrad and a master's degree. It's unthinkable that I would walk into a school and the principal places a paddle in my hand. After this education should open your mind. It should engage you in critical thinking, those kinds of skills as an adult. And so part of the healing process, I think, for our children is really reminding them of the power that they have. They don't step out of closet. They come from a line of DNA. So getting them to understand the history of their people. The Scholars of Peace were elders inside of Africa who would come together under a tree and talk and settle conflicts, whether it was, domestic conflicts around the region. And so we want to give our young people the tools and skills to resolve their own conflicts. And our Scholars of Peace really do speak to that. We use the talking stick. Only one person can talk at a time. You listen with your heart, not just with your ears. You listen with your heart. We teach young people about the earth and its vibration. And what does that mean? When you're outside and, you close your eyes and you can hear the sounds of nature and you can feel the vibrations in the earth. We plant. And so that's one way we teach our young people about putting their hands in the dirt and what does that mean, when you can feel this energy that goes through your hands. So it really is, when we started this work probably in 2000, it was such a hostile environment to even have a conversation about removing the paddle from the schools. There were instances when I have a twin who started this work with me. People wanted to physically remove us and toss us from the building. We stopped talking about it. But then in 2012, we could not stop talking about it in our communities. What really kind of, I think, lifted this whole intentional work around corporal punishment. We had a sister who was kidnapped by her partner from a Dollar General. Her 8-year-old son was in the car. He drove them away out into the community and he killed the mother in front of this 8-year-old. The sheriff was looking for this child, they're looking for the car. And we found the child walking back to the city with blood all over him. So can you imagine that? There's violence going on in the homes because as a Black community, we still believe in whipping children. They go to school and then they're exposed to more violence. Where is a safe place for our children? And that's what we've got to get schools to be: safe, supportive environments for our children. And I'll stop there, Chris, because I could get on this roll and I could go for a minute. But I just wanted to say our children deserve so much better. They deserve not to be hit. They deserve not to be talked down to not to be talked about. They deserve the kind of nurturing and love and support and hope that our ancestors has given to us. We've got a work to do, and that is to raise up the next generation of youth leaders, activists, liberation movement leaders. And so that's our goal, I think, as adults inside of our children's lives. I'll stop there, Chris.
No, thank you for that, Ellen. And I think, one of the key things that you raised with respects to healing and the trauma that students still face is how do we move away from the punitive piece, right? And I just want folks to understand that it's not just within corporal punishment. You have restraint and seclusion for students with disabilities where they are mechanically restrained with handcuffs, zip ties, or use of chemical restraints to deal with their misbehavior or things that may be a result of their disability and they don't know how to cope with it, or some type of trauma, stress, or harm that they are dealing with and they don't know how to deal with it. That doesn't mean that we have to be in this place and allow schools to be in non-supportive places where they are doing harm to Black and brown students, where they are physically and violently abusing them in ways just to correct misbehavior. So we should be very clear about what healing is, what it should not be, and how harm, trauma, and violence and the brutalization of specifically Black and brown students are still befalling them in our nation's schools. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Ham to provide an introduction for himself, but to also talk about the work that he is doing in the Baltimore City Public Schools from his position as the Chief of Police there. So Chief Ham.
All right, good morning, everybody. Sorry I'm jumping on the call late, but I was kind of inundated earlier with some things that we had to deal with. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Chief Ham.
All right. So one of the things that we did in 2016 was create an MOU between our officers and the principals on a clear delineation of roles and responsibilities for the police and for the administrators. So what that looks like is my office is not getting involved in student discipline. And that means going and getting kids out the classroom, telling kids not to walk the halls and take their hoodies off and take their face masks off, and not arresting kids for disruptive behavior, which we haven't done since 2016. The other thing that we did, and OSI helped us out with this, we were heavily trained, which the state took what OSI trained us with and made it mandated for all police officers that work in schools to have, and that's dealing with implicit bias, institutional racism, history of segregation, and building positive relationships, mindfulness, and all type of different trainings that helped us build relationships. And we also work with different advocacy groups to redo our policies. And so it's actually in our policy that we don't get involved in student discipline. And it's also in our policy that when it comes to use of force, there has to be determinations based on age, the size of the child, and the threat. Now, in terms of, I caught what you said last about kids with mental health, and we've had training in youth mental health first aid and trauma-informed care and all of those things. And what I could tell you, at least in my office, I can't tell you about anybody else's shop, but in my office, we let related services, which had the social workers and the school psychologists come under. The only thing we deal with during the school day is transporting kids at their request to the hospital if they have an emergency petition. We don't even initiate them, even though we can. We let related services deal with that. And that's a liability issue because they can't put them in their car and take them to the hospital. The other thing is we have, and I got a program tomorrow called Donuts with Dads. I'm actually at Sandtown Winchester Academy now on Gold Street in Cary. And we're going to have the Nation of Islam, Macedonia Baptist Church that's down the street, the pastor, some ex-offenders in the neighborhood, Safe Streets, and some other organizations that are going to do expungements, and they're going to do a food giveaway. And those are the type of things that we're doing. And next Friday, we're going to do it for the girls. We're calling Muffins with Moms, where we're going to bring female leaders in and do the same thing, but just for, the girls. And these are 5th and 6th graders. But I think through the process, we've seen significant reductions in arrests, as opposed to what Fox 45 said about us not arresting people in the schools being dangerous. That's not true, but we have significantly reduced arrests, probably about 95 to 98%. 10 years ago, we were arresting 1,000 kids a year. I think we arrested 18 this year so far. And OSI has been working with us along with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and some other groups to generate a diversion policy. Even though we're practicing this, we're trying to get the board to approve a policy so that if and when I retire, whoever comes in still has to go by whatever policy that we have.
Thank you, Chief Ham. I just want to pick up on the thread that I think all of us are coming from, right? And thinking about what does it mean to be healing and not punitive in nature for students, youth, children that attend schools, whether it's traditional schools, alternative schools, et cetera. So I'm going to pose a question to all of you from your vantage point and perspective. What are the tenets to having a non-punitive, supportive, holistic, healthy school environment? What does that look like to you all? And so I'm going to start with Chief Ham, and then we'll go to Ellen and then Deandre.
Okay, so just to answer your question, we only arrest students if they commit serious or heinous crimes. I'm talking about rape. I'm talking about robbery. I'm talking about a stabbing or using a weapon to commit in commission of a crime like a robbery. If they have a knife and they commit a crime. But if kids bring pocket knives to school, look, we all understand these kids are carrying these knives and stuff like that for protection. So that's dealt with through the code of conduct. And so I can't get into punitive in terms of that because it's not my lane. But I can just tell you from my perspective that we're not getting involved in student discipline. So when you say punitive, I mean, if you do rob somebody or you rape somebody or sexually assault somebody, or you bring a loaded handgun on a campus, like we do have to arrest the student for that. But just because kids get into a fight or a kid is walking the hall or being disruptive in the school, that's something that the school administration has to deal with. We don't get involved in that.
Thank you, Chief Ham. Deandre?
Thanks. For me, out here, we have created a great model that tackles all tiers to help our students start to heal. We at the district office has committed to it at the school level and for our communities. With our department, with the Restorative Justice Department, we have created times along with the teaching union to allow 2 45-minute periods of community building circles or restorative circles. We align our restorative justice to the MTSS framework, and we also have created our Healing Together initiative, which is funded to train teachers after school and during the summertime and train them inside our SEL components and inside our relationships first, which is our restorative justice system. Being able to reach out to our parents and also pay for them to come and get trained. And we train our school officers, we train our actual police, the Philadelphia police, and we have partnerships with the DA's office and our local colleges so that we can start to incorporate these programs inside our educational degrees. So we're giving lectures on restorative justice. We have minors in restorative justice. We have programs out at that come all over from UPenn, Drexel, University of Nebraska, to come and actually do research to give to our scholars to say, hey, this model, when we build relationships, when we really focus on loving our kids and making them feel welcome in school, that the academics will eventually comes with that too. When something happens at the house, we have a lot of our cops being trained in restorative justice inside trauma-informed care so they can communicate with us when something is happening outside of school hours. With the DA's office, they have a YAS program, which is their restorative justice. When we have one of our youth who's coming back to school, we're on the same page as the DA's office, and we already have a plan put together to support those students that are coming back into the public school. Charter schools, same thing. We have partnerships that any harm that's happening, that they can come to one of our 3 centers and get trained in restorative justice. We can have our parents meet and get them support. So it's a whole city initiative. Being able to say that our city is becoming restorative is the most exciting thing, because when we look at it, when you have all three systems on one of core, and which is very difficult to do, right? Politics is a very, very real thing. In a city of minorities, when we are very over policed and our incarceration rates are high, and we're one of the only cities that don't have an HBCU within the city, that shows a problem. So we're saying, hey, how do we combat this? Let's hit it in all segments. And we have a very liberal office inside the DA who's willing to work with us, who's willing to put funding where we need to fund after school programs, to open up more community centers. Idle time is bad time, right? If our students don't have anything to do, we know how that works. So we're opening up more sports programs. We're putting more money into our arts, into our sports, into our just our community as a whole. And we can fund the community and uplift our community. It would trickle into the school. So that's the best way to approach it. Is we're sitting there and we're going to do a whole city initiative to restore. And it starts with generational trauma. We got to tackle that first and move through the lines. Like my grandmother told me she don't got no trauma. And I'm like, all right, you watch your grandfather get beat by the police. That's trauma. It's there. To even just acknowledge it, that is happening, and that we can get mental health services, we can get everyone on the same page. That's the true idea of healing.
Thank you, Deandre. Ellen?
Yeah, Chris, that's a very loaded question and a good one. You know that the coalition we formed back in October 2020, a Mississippi Coalition to End Corporal Punishment. What we're finding is the environment is less hostile than it used to be. I was part of, there's a Mississippi Free Press Violence Solution Circles. In that conversation the other night, I was really pleased that people are at least leaning in now to understand that corporal punishment is very punitive. I'll start at the federal level. As you say, we're pushing for federal legislation, a suite of bills, Protecting Our Citizens School Act, that would eliminate corporal punishment and allow school districts to use a grant to look at alternative models. We're pushing for to get rid of seclusion, restraint, because those things really hurt children. Children has died as a result of that. We're asking for more counsels, not the criminalization of our children. So at the state level, we're just getting to the point. There are some restorative justice models that's being used, but not that many. I have a meeting next week with our superintendent. We no longer have corporal punishment, but we're looking at alternatives models to introduce the school to our Scholars of Peace program. We want models like mindfulness. We want models like yoga. We want, when children walk into the school door, I think Karen said it earlier, to ask them, how you doing? You know, how are you feeling today? Engaging children. You know, I have a nephew who used to say he would have to get his little brother to Head Start, then he would go to school, and he said, as soon as I walk in, they would say to me, you're late, go to detention. We've got to engage our children in a very different way. You know, I get that you have tests and we got to pass the test. In our communities, what does it matter that our children are not doing well on the test? We know they're not going to do well on the test. So why don't we engage our children in learning? That an environment that is supportive, where children feel like they have close relationships with their teachers. There's research that says if a child has one good relationship with an adult inside the school building, they're more likely to succeed. When we see our children, because part of my work around juvenile justice, I used to see children, especially black males, on the street, and I would say, why aren't you guys?
So I think we lost Ellen, and we will patch her back in when she gets back on. So thanks for that. I think where Ellen was going, and just so folks know, those suite of bills at the federal level to end corporal punishment and restraint and seclusion, and to address and adopt police-free schools, I dropped in the chat. And I think one of the things that Deandre brought up was sort of politics of the moment, right? And this is something that I think, undercuts the sort of healing pieces when we talk about what it means to heal and have safe spaces of healing for students that go to urban schools, right? And I think where, the question I want to ask the panelists is sort of, for those places that have, an array of politics at play, because I know Zeke mentioned it earlier, and so did Karen, where you don't have leadership that allows for alternatives to punitive practices, exclusionary discipline, whether we're talking about suspensions, expulsions, arrests, referrals to law enforcement, referrals to court. Chief Ham and Deandre, what would you say to those communities and those individuals who may, want to invest and engage in alternatives, but their leadership doesn't have the appetite, or the politics won't let them?
So the first thing that we started to tackle, because that's a great thing and that's a real thing, is with our youth. Me being a former history teacher, our youth has always led the charge from when we first started doing just movements, anything, college movements, high school youth. It's always been our 18, 17, 16-year-olds who has jumped in to this fight, and they are very vocal. They don't think about the future of what could happen to me. They thinking now, how can I make change now? What can I say? I was just training a bunch of youth RJ facilitators this morning, and they are from a very middle class area, great schools, and they're talking about school to prison pipeline. How can they go into the urban city and help and mentor people from a total different environment from them? And that's something that I enjoy and I love to see. But it starts with the youth. If youth are if the expectation is, when I mess up, that I can have a chance to work through my thought with someone, that I can give my accountability, but give a measure of like, all right, I harmed the community. How can I start to heal the community? I can come in front of the victim and say, I messed up. What can we do to start the healing together? When you have a movement of people that are coming together and saying, this is what we expect, this is our expectation, it's going to put the fire under the people that are against it. We see now, just looking at the global world, we see people like Ukraine and people putting fire on Russia and pulling their assets, pulling stuff. We see Nike do it all the time. When something is unjust, we see that they pull all the time. It's about putting the pressure on people to pour those resources for people or those funders, especially with politics. If we can just keep putting pressure, and that goes back to the voting. We had a lot of voting acts to suppress us, and we got to keep fighting that fight. We got to keep. Me and my wife every year when it's voting, we're out there. We're helping the elderly. My son, who's 3, he understands that it's our duty to help other people. At school, he's sharing his lunch. Sometimes he overshare his lunch with someone, right? But we gotta teach humanity to make someone understand that I'm a human just like you, and that I have humanity is what we break. Everyone has some type of little bit of implicit bias, right? But to sit down and to have that conversation with each other, and to see me as a human and I see you as a human, and we can talk through it. We might not agree on everything, but we can start to have that dialogue, which we can meet some common ground. Are we always going to agree? Absolutely not. But we have to put pressure on the powers that be to understand that when our students, if we have a whole school that's doing this well, I see it all the time. I see teachers be very resistant to this, but I see so many students doing, all right, we're going to have, if something happens, they have a mediation with each other, or they're circling up and the teacher's like, hey, what's going on? They're taking it into their own hands. I just come in and say, hey, this is the practice that we want to push. The teacher has to jump on board, because we're a little bit more fortunate that our school district aligned the restorative practices with the school implementing plan. They were able to implement the plan that, sometimes it goes to your paycheck. That's money talks. The people agree with green. So if we're sitting there and we say, hey, we're doing restorative justice, and I see that your classroom is getting lit up with tier 1, tier 2 things that could be handled at the classroom management level, and it's getting out of hand, then we're going to start to look back at you and say, what are you doing? What is the training that we need to receive? How are you communicating with that parent when that student did act up in class? Did you communicate with the parent, or did you just write them up? See, this now we got to hold people accountable on what they're doing, because the easiest thing to do is put a kid out.
Yeah, thank you for that, Deandre. And your budget and your investments identifies your priorities. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ms. Ellen so she can finish her thought. And then Chief Ham, I'm going to come to you with respects to answering the question around what do you say to folks that have politics and political leaders that don't allow them to come from a non-punitive space, because part of your model, Chief Ham, is centered in a police-free schools rubric, although police are still in the school. So I'll turn to Ms. Ellen, and then Chief Ham, I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Chris. I have very low bandwidth where I am in Mississippi, but to get back to this whole notion of healing, I think just like Deandre said, we have to engage young people. Our center we've been calling it a no-hit zone for 20 some years before I even knew what a no-hit zone was. Inside of our space, children are not permitted to hit each other. Adults are not permitted to hit each other. We have to talk through these things. I think we have to engage children very early on. Like from early on, I'm talking about 1 years old. I have a little 1-year-old around me that, she recognized we're in a no-hit zone. When Holmes County went from no corporal punishment, teachers would still hide rulers inside the classroom, but because the young people had been engaged in that conversation, they would come back and say, Miss Reddy, she still got a ruler in the classroom. Or they would say, Miss Reddy and them say, you can't hit me. So it's also about the relationship that you create with these young people, because we can't be inside the schools, but we send our young people inside the schools. So if they're equipped with the language, with the skills, where even if they are not sure, if it's 2 or 3 of them in a classroom, at least they know I got support over here if I bring this issue up. As I said earlier, I was frightened to even talk about corporal punishment because the environment was so hostile. So when you think about pushing a liberation movement that people aren't ready for, oftentimes you're standing there by yourself. You look around and it's like, okay, I guess I'll just go ahead and take this. So I think we really have to engage students in their own learning. It is their education, not our education. We've got to engage them in their own learning. We even take our young people through, what's your style of learning? I know I'm a visual and an auditory learner. We teach them, what's your style of learning? So if that teacher is doing nothing but standing up lecturing, you're not getting it. You got to hold your teacher accountable to say, this is how I learn. I want to pick up on something Deandre said. I think we also need more educators in this fight, because the reality is it's in your classroom where these things are happening. If someone's putting a board in your hand, say to your principal, nope, I don't want a board. I want some tools and skills. I want an opportunity to learn something new. And I think for the Black and Brown community, this is our time as a community. As Deandre said, we have generational violence. One of the projects we're doing is a documentary called Legacy of the Lash. We've got to talk about this intergenerational violence. I have a young elder over in one of my communities, his name Bubba, love him to death. He said to me one day, he said, when my mother used to beat me, she would draw, me and my brother, she'd draw a circle in the yard. She'd make us get down on our knees. She would take that whip and she would just pop it around our head. And I thought, whoa. And he was clear. We've got to talk about the trauma. He's 80 some years old. He still have that. Deandre, your grandma says she ain't got no trauma. We got to help them to understand what that be looking like, when they get older. But it is we've got to heal the community. It's not just in the school building. It has to happen inside of communities, because our children leave from oftentimes violent situations or unclear situations. Think about the pandemic and what that did to our children being in for the last 2 years. They were exposed to things that they will never be exposed to probably. So it is incumbent upon us. And I'll make this my last comment. We've got to push from the ground up. We have models. We just have to go back and utilize those models. So sometimes it's not going to come from the top down. It's going to come from the bottom. It's going to come from those folk who are impacted the greatest. That's where it's going to come from. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ellen. Chief Ham?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm sorry I got knocked off. One of the things I wanted to talk about was how restorative practices affected not only my department, but record, also suspensions. And the thing that we did was we hired a person to do restorative circles or mediation. And what it does is you get an immediate end to whatever the conflict is with that, because if you refer something to the criminal justice system, even if we arrest somebody, it may take 60 to 90 days for it to even go to court anyway. And you may have issues in between the time it happens and the time that they go to. So we saying that based off of what we're dealing with, that we need that, restorative practices in order to resolve it. I with our own staff, and we talk about it. They think I'm not the normal type of police chief, talking about stuff like this, but it's really helpful. You have people that don't think we should do that, black children, but I'm not on that page. I live in West Baltimore. I live on in West Baltimore, where a block down the street, they had a triple shooting last night. Somebody got killed, and it was 2 non-fatal shootings, like right down the street from me. So I grew up in West Baltimore, so I understand the plight and what's going on, and I want what's best for our kids. That's why I think it starts with, like it was said earlier, it starts from the ground up, but it also comes from leadership as well. I've been honored to be able to work under Karen Weber Indoor when she was in charge of school support, working for the school system, when somebody, some little kids went to school and stole a fish in a fish bowl. And and so
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Chief Ham. And I know we're 11:46 and we have a couple of questions. So I will post that for our panelists. And I think one of the things that Chief Ham was raising was that it starts with leadership, and that he's in a place to be in a place of leadership where he can effectuate change in a way that allows some of the work that he is doing in terms of restorative practices and circles, not arresting students for disciplinary actions, et cetera, to come from young people within Baltimore and to come from the youth. And so I think that is super important and very impactful, but understanding that there are places across the country who don't have that, right? Where you have leadership that is only looking to, and adults in the education system and within teachers unions that are only looking to punitize, harm, victimize, and brutalize Black and brown children, students, and youth. Because when you think about and what healing looks like in white schools and white suburban areas. They oftentimes don't have law enforcement in schools, and you aren't ever catching a teacher or administrator putting their hands on a white child. And so we should be very clear with respects to what that looks like and some of the racist policies and tactics that continue to permeate our urban schools and districts around these issues. So with that said, I'm just going to open it up to the Q&A. Rachel Duncan had a question for Chief Ham. What's the best way for families to collaborate on policy work that you're doing with the school board? So Chief Ham, if you could come back in and answer that question. And then I'll also open it up to the other panelists to answer that question as well, because I know all of us do work with school boards in our respective spaces. So Chief Ham?
One of the things that we're already doing is we're already meeting with, community groups, and I'm always open. Actually, we partner with, and everybody may not be familiar, but we have a youth program, a social justice program, actually two of them that we work with extensively. It's the Algebra Project and Youth as Resources. And actually, Youth as Resources developed a school police report card, which kids can actually go in anonymously and say, does my school police officer treat me with respect? Do they treat me like a criminal? Do I feel comfortable? Do we have a relationship? And all that kind of stuff. And overwhelmingly, it came back positively, and we routinely meet with these youth organizations along with the teachers union and the principals union. And my door is always open to any community organization or any parent that calls. We actually have an anonymous tip line where, people can call in and report when things are not being done in an efficient way, if they feel like that. And we follow up on it, and we treat all of it seriously.
Thank you, Chief Ham. Deandre, Ellen, do you want to sort of respond to the question on how folks can get engaged with the school board and work with families for family and student engagement? Just
Absolutely.
real quick, and then we'll move on to the next two questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that with us being a restorative district and a district that actually created an equity office, that we, especially when the schools engage inside the restorative justice work, part of the restorative justice team is the community member and the students. They are heavily influenced to make that connection to our officers inside the buildings. They are also a part of the restorative justice team. They get trained in the summertime on the restorative practices. When the disciplines happen with their code of conduct non-offenses and code of conduct offenses,
Oh, we can still hear you, Deandre.
I was like, something just.
You can still hear you. Go ahead.
With that happening, the officers are allowed to actually make a call if this is a restorative justice matter or the next matter. Even with that, we have officers, they're leading the restorative circles or our tier 2, which is our harm and healing circles. So our every aspect of the school community is involved in restorative justice.
Ellen?
I guess we're not necessarily using, and I'll speak for Holmes County, restorative justice circles internal to the schools, but as a community-based organization, we facilitate what's called a sexual response team. I'm answering the question around sexual harassment. In the South, there's this notion that, I won't go into that, but anyway, there's a notion in the South about the relationship between girls and men. But in our schools in particular, in the Holmes County School District, we've had 3 principals to be arrested around sexual contact with students. Oftentimes, You know, because in our community, this is another issue we don't talk about. We keep sexual abusers in the home with us because we won't talk about it. So the same culture that exists in the community oftentimes exists inside the school buildings. So within the last probably 5 years, we've had 3 different principals to be arrested and charged and convicted and gone to jail as a result of that. Because, and we're approaching April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, but part of our work as a sexual assault team is to be there when we know an incident is going on in the school. But this incident happened when we were doing a program inside the school building. The coach, and oftentimes we glorify in the South football players. Football player was now a teacher inside the schools, real young, but he said something that was inappropriate. And we, you know, supported the student in charging, at least bringing the issue up. And so we've really been pushing for males because it starts very early on. Oftentimes, sexual abuse of students in schools start in middle school with a grooming process. And so they may not do anything while they're in middle school, but when they get into high school, that's when we have some problems. So part of this is, you know, speaking about all of those issues, you know, we now have a female superintendent who's easier to talk to. We do not have a school board. Our board was dissolved early on because of safety, some financial issues. So we have what we call a transformative superintendent. And we have 5 years to get out of this situation we're in. So this is the groundwork we're laying as part of that 5-year process. Let's get restorative justice in. Let's get alternatives to punitive actions inside the school while we have a female leader in place. And I want, you know, again, and I'll just speak to this whole, particularly in the South, where you have women leadership, and particularly Black women leadership, you have the Church of God in Christ, which is the strongest faith-based church in the South. And so we don't even stand up in the pulpit as a woman and speak from the pulpit, we stand on the floor. So we still got some gender issues that we're working on that we work through. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Thanks, Ellen. And then I'm going to bring Karen Weber in to just synthesize some of what Chief Ham was saying before he was breaking up. So Karen?
Yeah, thank you for this. What I wanted to hone in on is that Chief Ham's police force is also very unique in composition. Most of the police officers are from Baltimore. Most of them are African-American men, and I mean overwhelmingly, they are African-American men from Baltimore with their children in this school system. So that gives them a totally different kind of skin in the game. And so when Chief Ham came in, the first thing he said is we are going to disrupt the school to prison pipeline because these are our children. And that resonated. And I want folks to understand that he has restorative practitioners who've been trained by the International Institute of Restorative Practices, who are police officers on staff, who train all the new police who come in and do refresher courses. So this is a real thing. I wish that we could get the same buy-in from everyone that we've gotten from school police. So when he spoke of arrests being 1,000 a year in the past, in the recent past, we're now talking about at worst 50 in a school year for crimes that cannot be ignored. So those are the 2 points that I wanted to bring up really quickly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. And we'll go back to Q&A. So Phil Leaf had a question, I think Deandre for you, but I think all of us specifically, how can they connect with students in Philadelphia, with the youth in Philadelphia and other surrounding nearby places to have conversations, to learn from one another, but to also begin to center youth. In the interest of time, Deandre, I'll let you take that if you can respond in 30 seconds, but Phil, I'll also say, I'll track down your information and we'll connect with Ellen, Deandre, and some other folks within spaces that I know have a cadre of youth that are working on these issues to see if we can't pull together some youth learning sessions and do this in a very robust way to make sure that youth are going to be centered, their voices will be, be heard, and they won't continue to be ignored. But Deandre, if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. You sum up pretty well that we're really especially in Philadelphia. Right now I train about 100 youth RJ facilitators. We have 3 centers that we're always open. My director and myself we're, as soon as you send an email out, we're right back on it, saying how can we plan, how can we work with you. We believe in cross circling up with different schools. I have 4 schools that meet with each other and they cross. So yeah, just send me an email, reach out, contact me, and we can make it happen. The school, my director and deputy chief is more than happy to fund it. If it's anything to do with restorative justice, they are cutting checks for us. And that's the biggest thing right there is if we need to take a trip to DC or to Maryland, Baltimore, anywhere that we need to go to meet with other youth and to share ideas, we're more than willing to do it. That's what it is. We're doing a lot of silo work in other cities, and we want to connect. So any way to connect, please let us know, and we're happy able to do that.
Thank you, Deandre, and we'll follow up with Phil. And then Gretchen had a question around the sexual assault, sexual violence, and how Restorative Circles addresses that. I think Ellen answered that, but we'll also make sure we can email her to get from the panelists to touch base on that. I think the last question from Brown Girl Wellness: what messages are we sending students when police officers are in schools? Why do we see more school officers in certain neighborhoods while some neighborhoods do not have any police presence? My oldest son is in high school and no police officer or police car is ever at his school. If we can do rapid fire 15 seconds to respond to that by all the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to Ann to close us out because we have a hard stop at 12. So Deandre, Ellen, Chief Ham, then myself, go.
With us, one of our circle norms is keep it 100, be honest. So we're very honest with our students and we let them know, like, hey, our community is struggling and we're working to be better. When our officers come into the building, they are trained in restorative justice. So we keep it 100 with them and we let them know, listen, one day, eventually we're going to change our community around so that we don't need to see this inside our community.
Thank you, Deandre. Ellen?
Black children and brown children have always been criminalized by the police or the military. We've got to determine what that relationship looks like inside of our communities and speak power to truth around that.
Chief Ham?
All right, we're very, hang on one second. I'm sorry, I'm having problems with my phone.
Well, Chief Ham, go ahead. Got 10 seconds. All right, I think we might have lost them. And I'll just say to the question on why are law enforcement in some communities and not others, well, it's also a part of the sort of intentionality and punitive practices that we see in racist policies, that Black kids are inherently bad and we treat them as deficits, where we need to get to a place where we have to start treating them as assets. And so thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Ann to close us out and tell us about the remaining panels that we have, but I will follow up with many of you all who had questions in far greater detail and connect Phil in terms of connecting with other groups and youth. So thank you all. Ann?